All right, welcome everybody to the research seminar for project Airborne Flux Measurement of Volatile Organic Compounds and Oxides of Nitrogen in California. My name is Shang Liu. I'm the contract manager for this project. I'm from Research Division of California Air Resources Board, or CARB. Slide. So this project is funded by California Air Resources Board and South Coast Air Quality Management District. The PIs for this project are Professor Alan Goldstein and Professor Ron Cohen from UC Berkeley, and the co-PI is Professor Anthony Buckles from Naval Postgraduate School. So this is the agenda for today's seminar. So at the beginning, I will give you some brief introduction of the project background. And then the project team, Alan and Ron, will present their findings from their field measurements. After that, we'll have questions and comments, and then we'll end the seminar by 4 p.m. So before I start introduction, there are some housekeeping items that I want to talk about. So first, the meeting will be recorded, and the recorded video will be posted to this contract webpage. So later, I'll type the address to the chat or Q&A, so that you can see this website. And if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat. Or you can raise your hand during the question and answer session. So here are some background information. So ozone and PM2.5 are major air pollutants, and California has been combating their pollution for decades. And as you can see from the figure, during the past decades, we have seen substantial reductions of both ozone and PM2.5 in California's San Joaquin Valley and South Coast air basin region. However, in the past 10 years or so, we are experiencing a slowdown in their reduction, and this is for both ozone and PM2.5. And you can see that their time series start to plateau, and we don't know why this is happening. And as a result, both the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast Air Basin are still classified as extreme non-attainment areas. And both regions don't meet the 70 ppb 8-hour ozone standard or the 12 microgram per cubic meter PM2.5 annual standards. So CARB has been tasked with mandates to develop state implementation plans, or SIPs, to achieve air quality standards. SIPs are comprehensive plans that describe how an area can attain the national air quality standards. And SIP components include important items, including photochemical modeling. So we are using this modeling effort to design and develop SIPs. And these models use emission inventories as inputs. And we know that both the modeling and emission inventory, they have uncertainties. So it requires comprehensive ambient measurements to improve the accuracy of both the modeling and emission inventory. So aircraft measurements can provide spatially resolved measurements, and those measurements can use to evaluate or justify photochemical modeling. And by careful design of the aircraft measurements, we can calculate the flux of different pollutants from different emission sources. So this is the purpose of this project. So in 2011, CARB funded airborne flux measurements of biogenic volatile organic compounds. So that project was led by Professor Alan Goldstein in collaboration with Naval Postgraduate School, basically the same team as in this project. So during that project, the research team pioneered airborne eddy flux measurements of biogenic volatile organic compounds with 2 kilometer resolution. So during that project, they used an instrument called PTRMS. It's a mass spectrometer. It's a portable mass spectrometer. So that instrument has relatively slow response, and also the resolution of the mass spectrometer has some limitations. So there were only a limited number of VOCs measured. So 10 years later, we know that there's changes in the emission sources, and also there are changes in atmospheric composition. And we see that there's a plateauing of the trend of ozone and PM2.5. So it is important to revisit the sources, chemical composition, and the chemistry of air pollutants to figure out why we are not seeing improvement in ozone and PM2.5 quality, air quality. So in 2021, we funded another campaign to measure the flux of VOCs and NOx. So during this project, the team used Focus PTRMS, which is the most advanced instrument for VOC measurement. So this instrument has a very fast response, and it can measure a full range of VOCs, including biogenic volatile organic compounds and anthropogenic volatile organic compounds. And also NOx was also measured during the measurement. So it was a very successful aircraft measurement campaign. And so far, within 2 years, the team have been able to publish 4 peer-reviewed papers in prestigious journals. And there's another paper under review. So it's very productive. And I'm going to stop here and hand it to Ellen and Ron to talk about their findings. Let me stop sharing now.
Okay.
All right. So Ellen, can you share your screen?
All right. And let me get to the point where I'm actually sharing.
That's good.
Okay, I think that's good. And I've got one more little thing to change. And then I can go ahead. Well, first of all, thank you to Shang for the wonderful introduction and setting the stage for our talk. Today, we're going to be giving you the results from our project. Our title was Airborne Flux Measurements of Volatile Organic Compounds and Oxides of Nitrogen in California. And this was really a large-scale effort that involved a lot of people. And Ron Cohn and I will be presenting the results today, but we're really representing the work of our teams, our graduate students and postdocs who were involved. In particular, I would say Eva Fennerstel, Chindan Zhu, and Clara Nussbaumer have written all the papers so far. We had additional collaboration from teams of people at NOAA who did forecasting and meteorology for us, and also helped us in various aspects of data analysis, interpretation, and modeling of emissions. And we worked as well with a team from Caltech that was led by John Seinfeld, who added a few things that weren't actually part of our CARB contract, but gave us the ability to measure methane and CO2 in particular. So there were 2 different CARB contracts involved for this. One focused on the South Coast Air Basin. That was the original contract. And then CARB added a smaller contract so that we could do flights also in the San Joaquin Valley. And then the South Coast Air Quality Management District added focus on NOx that mainly funded the Cohen Lab. So I'll go ahead. Just a few pictures to acknowledge the team. My team is in the upper left. That's my complete research team, goes beyond the people who were just part of this campaign. And in the lower left are some people from Ron Cohen's research group. And on the right is the core team that actually did the aircraft measurements, and that is a Twin Otter aircraft owned by the Naval Postgraduate School in the background that flew all of our research flights. So I just want to go over a few questions, directing your attention to what we'll be discussing this talk. But the key point is that we were trying to provide new top-down constraints on total emissions in the Los Angeles Air Basin and the San Joaquin Valley Air Basin, and then compare those emissions to inventories that are used for air quality modeling. And being able to do this from the top down means that we can get a sum of all the emissions and then compare it to the inventories, which are really based on adding up the emissions from lots of individual sources. And so there's uncertainties in putting together those emission inventories, and the uncertainty in each sector that's being added to the inventory can be different. But when we get to do top-down flux measurements from the aircraft, then we get a pretty uniform look at all the emissions that are actually happening, and with a common range of uncertainty in those emissions. So that is really why we're using the airborne flux measurements, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we'll run. We want to look at how the VOC and the NOx emission inventories in the South Coast Air Basin and San Joaquin Valley compare to observations. And then we also want to look at some of the drivers, such as what role does temperature play in driving the urban VOC and agricultural NOx emissions, as well as looking at all the individual sources. As Sean mentioned, we have actually been quite active in publishing our results, and so far we have 4 published papers, one on the NOx emissions in the San Joaquin Valley, one on the NOx emissions in LA, and then one that just came out in Environmental Science and Technology on the spatially resolved airborne flux measurements and emissions of VOCs in Los Angeles, and another one on the same type of focus in the San Joaquin Valley. And we've got finally one more in review. And there's one paper by Ben Schultz from John Seinfeld's lab that is in review on the emissions, mainly focusing on methane in the San Joaquin Valley and the role of dairies. So as Sean mentioned, also the Los Angeles and San Joaquin Valley are both hotspots of air pollution, and we have problems with ozone and particulate matter exceeding air quality standards in both those regions. And we know well that ozone and most of the PM is actually secondary, and it's formed from VOCs and NOx that were emitted in the regions that are oxidizing and forming these secondary products. So for the next set of introductory slides, I'm going to turn things over to Ron. And Ron, just tell me what you want me to switch slides.
I will. Thanks, Alan. So I want to add my thanks to our team. I'll note that Anthony Buchholz and Chindan Zhu are in the audience, so we're going to direct all the hard questions to them at the end. But I want to thank them and all our other partners in this. So when we set out to do this experiment, we were cognizant that one of the key parameters you can change over time, and that has been changing over time, are emissions from passenger vehicles. Catalytic converters on cars have been introduced and really effectively reducing NOx and passenger vehicle VOC for a long time, and that's been one of the key tools we have as air quality managers for improving the air. And then we're cognizant that the worst air quality happens often on hot days. So I just want to draw your attention to this idea that we have been making improvements in air quality even into recent years, although if you look at the quote ozone design value, it doesn't quite look that way. So you see on the left here, if we look not at 70 ppb, the regulatory standard, but 100 ppb, and follow the the number of days that are over 100 ppb, when it's above 30 C, you see a steady drop all the way to today, or in this case to 2019. And you see that for most of that time, there was a weekend effect where you were more likely to be above 100 on the weekend than you were on a weekday. But in the most recent years, it's flipped. That today you're more likely to be above 100 on a hot day on a weekday than on a weekend. And then you can see if you're just a little bit cooler, if you're between 25 and 30 C, in the present time, you're never above 100. So we have made tremendous improvements in air quality, and they persisted all the way to 2020 if your threshold was 100. On the other hand, if you're, and this is at San Bernardino, so just one location in the South Coast, if instead you say your threshold is 70, which is the regulatory mark, every single day on a hot day in San Bernardino, you're above that threshold. And so as the climate is changing and it's warming and we're likely to have more days above 30, we're guaranteed to have more high ozone days, because essentially every single day above 30 is above the ozone standard. But even there, on a cool day, there's been steady progress. And so that I just want to highlight that there are ways to look at our success in improving air quality that are not quite as negative as if we only use the ozone design value, because we really have continued to make success and continued progress. And you see again and if you look above 70, you see we're at this point where the odds of having a day above 70 are the same on a weekday as a weekend. And that means we're right at the peak ozone production, and continued reduction of NOx is pretty much guaranteed to lower ozone at this point. But of course, first on weekends and then on weekdays. So one way we can put these long-term trends in context is to look here at just a conceptual model of what's happened to VOCs. So 10, 15 years ago, we could put all of our attention on VOCs from vehicles. And we've very effectively reduced those to the point now where VOCs from vehicles and VOCs from a whole mix of other sources, volatile chemical products that Alan will talk about later, biogenics that we'll talk about, emissions that we have indoors, both in our homes and restaurants that are moving to outdoors. We're roughly at this crossover point where all of those emissions are comparable to vehicles. And then in the next slide, this is how I want you to think about temperatures. As the temperature goes up, all of those other kinds of emissions go up. And so vehicles become even less important on a hot day than they are on an average temperature day. And it's this conceptual model of thinking about the extremely important role of temperature changing the mix of what VOCs are important that drove a lot of the design of how we went about doing these experiments. We chose to fly on a hot day and a cold day, or at least as hot as we could get and as cold as we could get in the month of June in both LA and in the San Joaquin. And I should say, this is not just about ozone, it's also about summertime aerosol. Here's the organic aerosol in the South Coast Basin from 2004 to 2009. You see this very steep temperature dependence. And similarly, even 10 years later, 16 to 18, again, there's a steep temperature dependence, but the organic aerosol is lower. So we've been very effective at controlling, but still on a hot day is when we're most likely to be violating the standards. And it's almost linear here. So back to you, Alan.
Okay. So in June 2021, we spent about a month doing airborne flux measurements for emissions mapping. And what you see in that picture is the wing of the plane, and showing you roughly what a footprint looks like. And when we're flying, we're integrating over footprints that are changing as we move. but we're really getting an emission per area and per time as we fly. Now, the goal here is to learn about sources. So where are they? How much is emitted? What are the key sources? What is emitted? Then we want to use that information to validate emission inventories. And so we were able to get time to fly 9 flights over the South Coast Air Basin. And we covered about 9,000 kilometers when we did that. And you'll see in a few minutes that those 9 flights were designed to repeat flying over the same areas under different conditions so that we could get good range of observations of fluxes. And we also flew 7 flights over the San Joaquin Valley with the same basic principle, where we designed flight pattern that we kept repeating under different conditions. So the experimental design, again, was focused on flight days and patterns, so the timing and location, and they were designed to investigate important emissions that lead to formation of summer ozone and SOA. And some of the key design parameters were, as Ron mentioned, we were interested in temperatures, so we chose days to fly in each region based on weather. So we tried to get a series of hot days in both, and more moderate temperatures in both regions. We also focused on distributing the weekday and weekends that we were flying so that we got observations in both regions. Largely that's driven by the fact that NOx emissions change substantially on weekends, because a lot of the NOx emissions are actually due to truck emissions, and those trucks don't operate as much on the weekends. We also designed our flights to cover a wide range of sources, including highways, residential areas, shipping, the port, valet, agricultural farming, agricultural processing, oil and gas, among others. And again, we flew the same patterns over and over so that we got a good statistical validity on our emissions. So here is the indication of one of the days that we flew, and we measured fluxes all over essentially the major parts of the South Coast Air Basin that are flat. The approach that we're using, eddy covariance, works better when we fly over level terrain. And so you can see that we avoided the mountains a little bit, but we flew over large areas of flat land. We had to fly low and slow to optimize the measurements of emissions and to get them on scales that are relevant to air quality modeling. So in general, we flew at 400 meters above ground level at about 50 meters per second. And the flux footprints, and I'll show you more examples of this, but the flux footprints on average are on the scale of a few kilometers, which is equivalent to the scale at which emissions are modeled for air quality. So on that aircraft, we have, well, the aircraft itself is equipped with a radome probe that can measure the wind very fast in 3 dimensions. And then we had a VOCs PTR TOF MS that was built specifically into a rack for this aircraft. And that measured hundreds of different VOCs simultaneously. And then there was a laser-induced fluorescence instrument from Ron's group for NOx. And as I mentioned before, we did have measurements of CO2 and methane in addition, but I won't be showing any of that today. So from this data, we derive fluxes from the covariance of the vertical wind speed and concentration by wavelet transformation. We apply vertical flux divergence corrections for losses or changes in flux with altitude. And then we spatially resolve trace gas exchange information throughout these flights. So on the left here are 2 examples of fluxes that we measured. These are just 2 individual compounds, but there are interesting ones to us and I think to CARB. In the upper left is benzene. In the lower left is ethanol. And one of the points I want to make here is in the title that fluxes aren't actually influenced by chemical transport, but concentrations are. So when we look at the concentrations of those same tracers on the right, one of the things that you'll note is that the distribution of the tracers of ethanol and benzene, although their sources are quite different, their distributions are similar. So all the emissions in this region are moved by wind. They can be transformed as it's moving, but you can see that the concentrations are generally higher up here in the region between El Monte and Rancho Cucamonga, and leading out to San Bernardino, and that's true for both compounds. And concentrations are generally lower along the coast, near Long Beach, with some high concentrations around LA. But when we look at the fluxes themselves, we can see actually where those compounds are coming from, and that's very valuable for us when we're trying to understand how to check the emission inventories themselves. Okay, so again, this emphasizes the idea that we want to see our fluxes, and these are the average fluxes that were measured over the South Coast Air Basin from all the flights. And you can see that the distribution is interesting. There's a fair amount of ethanol, actually almost about a quarter or a little more of the fluxes were actually ethanol, and methanol is fairly large too. You had some other alcohols and carbonyls, some alkenes, aromatics, and then a group of other hydrocarbons. But then the monoterpenes and isoprene were also a pretty substantial contribution. When we think about the chemistry, we have to remember that these fluxes are changed by chemical processing and transport, so that the concentrations that we measure at altitude actually look a little bit different than the fluxes, because many of the compounds that are more highly reactive show up at very, very low concentrations, while chemicals that have longer lifetimes, like methanol and ethanol, tend to have larger concentrations. So again, the goal of this campaign was to measure the actual fluxes, the emissions, and be able to compare those to the inventories. So this is the average mass flux for the South Coast Air Basin. Again, it's largely dominated by the oxygenated VOCs, but there are substantial contributions from compounds that are normally thought of as biogenic, isoprene and monoterpenes, and also, of course, aromatics, which are important for secondary aerosol formation as well. And what we want to do now is look a little bit at how important these are. And there are two ways that we're going to try to do that. One is to look at the OH reactivity of the VOCs that are emitted. And OH reactivity is a very important parameter in thinking about secondary chemistry, and in particular ozone formation. But you can see that when we look at the chemical impact on OH reactivity of all these VOC emissions, isoprene and monoterpenes have a very large impact. So they're more than half of the OH reactivity. And these compounds that have shorter lifetimes, like longer lifetimes, like methanol and ethanol, they're a substantial part of the flux, but a smaller part of the resulting OH reactivity. Another key thing that we want to be able to look at is the secondary organic aerosol formation potential of these VOC emissions. And here again, you find that the monoterpenes are extremely important, but also so are the sesquiterpenes. And together, the monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes, we estimate as, plus isoprene, we estimate as contributing about 60% of the SOA formation potential of all the emissions that we observed. And that's quite substantial. And as you'll see as I go along, that's actually more than is predicted by current models. Okay, as we're flying, at each point we're making measurements, there's a footprint that depends on the meteorology at the time, including the wind direction and the vertical mixing. But this gives an average look at how big our footprints are, generally thinking about the footprints as 4 to 6 kilometers long, but most of it being within the first 2 kilometers. This is temperature to 90% coverage. And you can see that as we flew the plane, we really did cover most of the flat areas in the South Coast Air Basin. And again, we did that 9 times. I'm going to switch over to Ron and let him talk about some of the NOx flux results.
So we just want to give you a couple examples. So here you see 2 different flight days flying the same flight track. On the right, a day when the winds were more still and less perpendicular to the aircraft. And on this day, the footprints were small, and they reflected the fluxes we measured were a better reflection of what was immediately and directly below the aircraft. In this case, that was the highways. So those yellows that you're looking at are a day when the flux footprints were small and we were seeing the highway directly below us. We flew the same flight track on a day when the crosswinds were much more significant and the footprints were therefore much broader. And you can see on those days the apparent flux is much smaller. And that's entirely because the flux footprint, the range of locations on the ground that we were sampling as we flew was a much wider selection. So you could say that that's a negative result, or you could say that that's informing us quite directly that those areas adjacent to the highway that we sampled more of on that flight labeled A have much lower emissions than the highways themselves. So next slide. So here's one of the first examples we'll show you today of a comparison between the flux that we measured and the inventory that's used in the ARB models. In our analysis, we looked at emissions from ARB models, from the NOAA model, and from some other models for the various aspects. So the one on the left, recap, that's our name for this experiment. And in this case, what you can see most clearly is that there are very high NOx fluxes at the eastern edge of the Los Angeles basin, and sort of uniform mid-range fluxes everywhere else. If you look at the middle panel at the inventory, you see quite high fluxes from the port and from in downtown Los Angeles. The ones in downtown Los Angeles have a reasonable correspondence with our measurements. It appears that the airport and our measurements don't agree, but you shouldn't interpret that. That's really because we were not able to fly this plane over LAX. And therefore, we don't really have good flux measurements in that bright yellow spot at the left of the ARB inventory. And then you can see the difference in the right panel. You see, whites are where the difference is small, and over large regions of the basin, the differences are not that much. We see much higher fluxes at the eastern basin. We speculate that that's because there's been a significant increase in warehousing, Amazon and other companies locating distribution centers at that edge of the basin, and that the inventory has not kept pace with the change in the pattern of trucking in the basin. And then we have notably lower emissions at the coast, and that would appear to be, on average, a real thing, but it also includes the fact that we didn't sample at the airport. So next slide, I think, is back to Alan.
That's right. So now I'm going to show you some comparisons of the VOC flux measurements with the inventories. And the way that this is presented is actually looking at the ratio of the inventory. In this case, it's a BICE +5 VCP inventory, which is fundamentally what the NOAA inventory results were. And that's divided by the observations, and it's in percent. And so anything below 100% means that the inventory was underestimating. So that means the orange and red suggest underestimates in the inventory. And then everything over 100% is that the inventory was underestimating in red. The inventory is overestimating in blue. And you can see that that's distributed with some grid squares with overestimation, some with underestimation, and it is a little bit regionally specific. So, for example, in this area where Ron was mentioning, there were a lot of relatively new warehouses. The inventory is actually underestimating, but in other areas, it's doing a better job or overestimating. Now, that's the NOAA Chemical Sciences Lab inventory. On the right is the CARB inventory divided by the observations, and you can see, the results are a little bit different. The orientation of the inventory is also a little bit different. So that's just a result of how the inventory is set up. But you can see in this region, getting near San Bernardino and a lot of the factories, more industrial areas, the inventory is underestimating, but it's doing a better job kind of in the downtown area and some of the more populated regions. And again, the new warehouses area, it looks like the inventory is underestimating. So for monoterpenes, here we see the comparison for the NOAA inventory and for the CARB inventory. Now, again, we're using the same scale, but the red is much more prominent. And in fact, if you look at the monoterpene emissions divided by, the inventory divided by the observations, what you find is that the emissions are actually about 5 times higher than the inventory says for monoterpenes. And that is a major issue that I think CARB needs to try to address for monoterpenes, but also it's true for sesquiterpenes. So future inventories really need to be corrected for this. Ethanol is another interesting example. There's the NOAA inventory divided by the observations, and here's the CARB inventory divided by the observations. And the key thing to see here is that the inventory underestimates ethanol across the whole region. And so the underestimates of ethanol are actually quite large. Looking more across the board at the comparison for individual compounds between the NOAA inventory, which we call BICE plus 5 VCP, versus the measured emissions, you can actually see that they agree for a lot of compounds, but there are some that are much higher in the measurements than in the inventories. I think more relevant maybe for CARB is, I'm sorry, let me just say that that's the VOCs. Maybe more relevant for CARB here is the comparison between our measured emissions and the CARB inventory. And here we see some really interesting features. First of all, for many compounds, the inventory emissions and the measured emissions actually agree well, but there's quite a few compounds whose emissions are much higher than the inventory suggests. And ethanol, which I already talked about, is up here. This is acetic acid, other organic acids, cresol and phenol, benzyl aldehyde, naphthalene. So there's your monoterpenes. So you can see there are a lot of points to focus on in terms of potential improvements for the inventories. But I want to add that some of the key markers that we had for vehicle emissions are these aromatic compounds, benzene, xylene, and toluene. And in fact, the emissions in the inventory matched very well with our measured emissions on average. So it seems, at least for the benzene, xylene, toluene, that the inventory is doing quite well, representing emissions that are dominated by vehicles. So when we sum up all the emissions and we compare it to inventories, we see some significant mismatches. And this is just the total flux. The specific compounds or groups of compounds are indicated in colors, and a clear difference, sorry, I'll stay here. A clear difference is actually this blue bar which is the ethanol. So the inventories are substantially underestimating the ethanol, but also the mono and sesquiterpenes, which we show up here. And in the top color, it's isoprene. And you may be able to pick out that the inventories are actually overestimating the isoprene emissions compared to the measurements. So, again, I just highlighted the ethanol as being one of the major discrepancies. It's useful to look at how this plays out when we think about the chemistry resulting from these emissions. And this is the VOC-OH reactivity of the emissions. And you can see the measured VOC-OH reactivity is actually quite a bit higher than in the carb inventory, and it matches a little bit more closely with the NOAA inventory. But again, there are some discrepancies for things like monoterpenes, and that there are also differences in the isoprene, where the carb and the NOAA inventories are overestimating the isoprene emissions and its contribution. And similarly, for the SOA formation potential, there are large differences, and those large differences are mostly driven by the mono and sesquiterpenes that you see here as being very high contributions from the measurements scaled to SOA formation potential, but there are also some other categories that contribute. Ron spoke a little bit about temperature being important. It's interesting to try and compare the emissions in the inventories to the measurements at different temperatures. One of the things that we saw clearly is that for the measurements, there are large temperature differences. And so you can see at with all the data less than 28 degrees separated from all the data with more than 28 degrees, there's about a factor of 2, nearly a factor of 2 increase at higher temperatures in total emissions, but these are not represented significantly in either the NOAA inventory or the carb inventory. And so work needs to be done on the temperature dependence of emissions in these inventories. To look in a little bit more detail at just a few compounds, here we're showing the emissions as a function of temperature for isoprene. The observations are here in the gray showing the range, and the black showing the means versus the inventories. You can see that the inventories actually have the temperature dependence, but they're overestimating the emissions for both the NOAA and the carb inventories. When we look at monoterpenes, we see exactly the opposite. The monoterpene observations have emissions that are, again, a factor of 5 higher than the inventories, with a stronger temperature dependence than is in the inventories. BTF is interesting compound that is a volatile chemical product that is not currently in the carb inventory, but it is in the newest NOAA inventory. And this is a comparison of our observations to the inventory emissions. And you can see at high temperatures, the inventory is matching pretty well with our observations, but at low temperatures, our observations are quite a bit below the inventory. And that's largely because the inventory doesn't really include much temperature dependence, but in fact, in the observations, we see a significant one. We get the same story essentially for toluene, where we see a temperature dependence in the observations, but that's not really represented in either of the inventories. But the inventories match observations reasonably well at just at the highest temperatures. So looking at the impact on VOC-OH reactivity for all the observed compounds versus temperature, we see a strong temperature dependence, but also here we're indicating the very strong role of the terpenoids, and that's monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, as well as isoprene. And you can see at the highest temperatures, they're more than half of the total. And let's see, this is also even more true for the SOA formation potential of the VOCs from the surface flux, where the terpenoids play an extremely large role. This is getting at really some of the same ideas, but we're looking at now the distribution of the number of grid cells with a certain fraction of terpenoid OHR flux. And the key thing that I want you to see here is that the fraction of the contribution of the terpenoids to the OH reactivity flux is much higher at higher temperatures. So we're getting up, typically around 70% versus more like 40% at the lower temperatures. And similarly for the SOA formation potential, we see a much larger contribution from the terpenoids at higher temperatures. So just summing a few of the things that I just said, the terpenoid fraction, the OH reactivity and SOA formation potential increases a lot with temperature, and therefore the SOA formation potential will increase as climate warms due to temperature-dependent terpenoid emissions. The inventories don't do a good job yet of predicting the temperature dependence of solvents, and that needs to be improved. And also the current CARB inventory needs improvement, particularly in predicting the oxygenated VOCs and the VCP emissions, which are generally quite low for, but the importance of those emissions has been growing over time as the vehicular emissions are declining. I think I'll turn this over to Ron to continue.
So let me sum up this section with some discussion of where we think the implications are for controlling ozone in the South Coast Basin. I want you to remember that one of the things that's happening, and you can see it in the record, is there will be more frequent heat waves and more frequent hot days. So it's becoming ever more imperative to be thinking about the chemistry of hot days in the future as distinct from the average day today. You can see now, and just show you on hot days, VOC increase due to the strong temperature dependence. We didn't show you this, but we didn't see that for NOx. The nitrogen oxides has almost no, if not no temperature dependence. And so that means you're dramatically changing the VOC to NOx ratio on a hot day. This graph here sort of gives you a sense of what's happening in terms of production of ozone. Each of those curves is a production of ozone, and you can think of your odds of being on one of those higher curves where there's more VOC are higher in a future climate. They're hot, they're guaranteed to be further up on a hot day. And then you can see those, the likelihood of where you are in terms of production of ozone. So in the present day, we're sitting right at this transition in that gold star. But if we reduce NOx, we're going to get a little bit more ozone. On a hot day or in a future climate when you're more likely to be hot, because of the increased VOC and the change in the VOC to NOx ratio, you're actually on the other side of the curve. So on a hot day, nitrogen oxide controls are more effective than on a cold day. And you can see that, so that would put you at that red star. And if you're at that red star and you reduce NOx, you get an immediate benefit. So because we know right now from observations, we're at this transition, we can measure the odds of being above some threshold of ozone on a weekend and weekday, and find that we're roughly at equal probability of violating the standard in many locations in the South Coast Basin, weekdays and weekends. That means we're right at that peak. And so NOx controls are about to be immediately effective. And because many of the compounds Alan told you about arise from trees, we're unlikely to have an ozone control strategy of chopping down the trees in Los Angeles. There's too many other benefits for trees. So it puts ever more imperative on reducing NOx as we go forward. Okay, so next slide. We want to turn to the other half of our project now, to thinking about the San Joaquin Valley. Many of the same issues apply. What's really different about the San Joaquin Valley is all the farming and the different kinds of emission from farming. And I want to start by saying that the nitrogen oxide emissions from farming are contentious. They're widely discussed in the literature, and it was one of the more exciting opportunities for us to make an impact. Here's two examples of models of NOx emissions from agriculture that are in the literature. And I want you to notice those two red arrows. The red value in the paper by Grow from 2020, which shows only a few hotspots in the Central Valley, is the same amount of annual NOx emission per unit area as blue in the other figure from Almaraz. So these two figures have the same spatial pattern, but their magnitude is a factor of 100 or 1,000 different. So those are two things that got into the literature. They're things we have to contend with as we think about the role of agricultural and nitrogen oxide emissions in the state. Next slide. So what we did was we flew, and you can see the flight tracks here on the left and the footprints associated with them. And then we used a strategy of trying to separate the highways from the cities from the soils, and identifying the NOx flux from each of those three different sectors. And you can see the results. Not surprisingly, the highways have the highest NOx flux per unit area. That's what you would expect. We've taken combustion engines and deliberately localized them to transport goods along the highways. You see that the average emissions from the cities in the Central Valley is about, somewhere 40% to a half of what's on the highway per unit area. And then the unique feature here is we're able to disentangle what was the soils. And the soil NOx emissions are about 3/4 of what's going on in the cities. It's a high number. But I should say it's not a number that's at all out of line with the standard biogeochemical model. It's just very different than what's in most air quality models. But if we go to any of our friends who put a chamber down on the soil and we build a box model with parameters that match what our friends who measure soil NOx have calculated, it looks very much like what we measured here. So the next slide. The next slide just shows a couple of features of comparison to the inventories. So in the left one, we show the urban and the highways. So urban in blue, highways in orange. And the NOx emissions look reasonably similar in the inventories to the measured fluxes. They're slight details in magnitude, but some of those, a lot of those we think have to do with the resolution of the model as much as anything else. But on the other hand, the soil NOx looks nothing like it. So on the right, you see soil NOx as we measured it. It's that pinkish box with large error bars, a mean of about 0.3 milligrams of nitrogen per meter squared per hour. And then two of the common NOx models that are used to model biogenic NOx in air quality models. And they're Megan and Weiss. And what I'll tell you about these, those are both models that are developed by people who were extremely focused on biogenic VOC emissions. Both of those models do a plausible job on biogenic VOCs, and both of them tacked on biogenic NOx because they knew they had to, but none of the people who worked on those models were biogenic NOx experts, and they didn't put a lot of attention into it. The third model is over there. The one in red is the one that we built. That model is incorporated into the GeosChem model. It's other people have brought it into WRF CMAC and WRF Chem. And that model is faithful to what we understand about biogenic NOx emission based on our colleagues who've done chamber studies at soils. And you can see that model is at least in the same ballpark as the observations. So I think our conclusion is that air quality models need to go back to the biogeochemistry literature and use a model for soil NOx that is biogeochemically tested based on observations at soil chambers. It would also help if they were tested against our fluxes, but before they even go to our fluxes, they should look like chamber measurements in some respect. Next slide. We'll add that the biogeochemical soil models are based on microbes and microbial activity in the soil, metabolizing ammonium to make nitrate, and along the way they leak NOx, either NOx that's naturally in the soil or NOx that's accumulated from industrial activity or fertilizer, whatever the source of nitrogen is. And those microbes multiply and are more active when it gets hot. So soil NOx emissions are known to go up as temperature goes up. And we observe that, and that's also in this particular model that we built, the Berkeley, Dalhousie, Iowa soil NOx model. The temperature dependence that we measured and the temperature dependence that we observed were the same, just the magnitude's different. That's another support for this idea about how to parameterize soil NOx in models in the future. So I think this supports a number of models that have been contentious that say soil NOx in the San Joaquin is an incredibly important parameter to thinking about ozone, makes it more difficult to reduce total NOx, certainly more difficult if our only strategy is focused on cars. But there's with the right kind of modeling of the soil NOx, I think we would have a much better chance of thinking about the alternatives in the future. As we'd be able to examine the levers both on other kinds of NOx and on soils as we think about how to reduce ozone and aerosol in the San Joaquin. I think it's back to you, Alan.
Okay, so we'll focus for the next few slides on the VOC fluxes in the San Joaquin Valley. And this is just the overall picture of what we observed on average for the San Joaquin Valley. On the left is the mass flux, and you can see the really large role played by oxygenated VOCs, where methanol, ethanol, other alcohols, and acids and carbonyls make up 3/4 of the story or more. Adding all the other oxygenated VOCs, we're really talking about something close to 80% of the total emissions. But if we then use a different lens to look at these data and think about how important they are for the chemistry, we can see that for the OH reactivity flux, the isoprene emissions and the monoterpene emissions together account for about half of the OH reactivity flux. And all these oxygenated VOCs, while important, their relative role diminishes just because they have longer lifetimes in the atmosphere. And the next question really is, what are all the sources of these compounds? And of course, this is going to be quite different from what we saw in the Los Angeles area because of the difference in the landscape and all the agriculture and industry that's there. So there are a multitude of VOC sources in the San Joaquin Valley. This is an image showing our typical flight tracks, and you can see that we flew through urban areas like Bakersfield and Fresno. We also flew along the oak woodlands in the foothills, and we flew through a lot of the agricultural region, the center of the valley. And as we look at this region, it's important to note that there's uneven distribution of source categories as well. So the dairy and cattle farming is very large in this region. This is a picture just of what some of those operations look like from the air. There's a lot of crops throughout the region that you can see again in the image. There are highways going through the region where we have truck and car emissions, oak shrublands along the edges of the San Joaquin Valley. Where we start getting the foothills, we get oak shrubland, and that turns out to be an extremely important source of isoprene. And then there's also a lot of oil and gas industry industry in the San Joaquin Valley, and this is just an image of one particularly prominent area near Bakersfield where there's a lot of oil and gas extraction. And also we've got urban areas such as Bakersfield. So when we look at the emissions and then compare them with emission inventories, we see a lot of interesting things. First of all, this is the emissions of methanol in the San Joaquin Valley, minus with the measurements minus the carb inventory. So these are actually given in flux rates. So if the emissions are if the emissions of measurements minus the inventory are above zero, that means that the inventory is low. That these are emissions that are not well represented. And if you look at the carb inventory, you can see that there's some areas where the emissions in the inventory are quite low. And over the top of this image, we're trying to show where the dairy farms are. In this area where there are a lot of dairies, the inventory underestimates emissions significantly. The BICE +5 VCP inventory does a little bit better job of matching the measured emissions, but there are some hot spots that are still missing the model. So methanol is underestimated by the carb inventory, and that's mostly due to the dairies. Phenol and cresol emissions are also underestimated by the emission inventories, and some of that is, again, likely due to the dairies up in this region, but you can also see that in the area around Bakersfield, that's an urban center. So these chemicals are of particular concern due to their SOA formation potential, and also due to some of the odor complaints near dairies. Isoprene emissions in the croplands are actually substantially overestimated. So you can see all these numbers are negative with the measurements minus the inventory. That means that the inventory is overestimating. We actually showed this previously in our 2011 Cabernet campaign, but still, even 10 years later, the inventory is overestimating the emissions, and it's largely got to do with the landscape descriptions of what vegetation is there that are included in the models, and that really does need some focus. And that's true both in the carb inventory and in the NOAA inventory. When it comes to the area where there's a lot of oak trees, over on the right side, circled in yellow, those are the oak shrublands. You can actually see that the inventory and the measurements agree really, really well. So in the oak shrublands, oak forests that represent most of the isoprene emissions in California, the inventories are actually doing quite a good job. Okay, looking at the OH reactivity flux from isoprene, you also see that this is now the ratio of the carb inventory to the measurements with isoprene and without isoprene. And you can see that with isoprene, the carb inventory is really overestimating the contributions of VOC emissions, the inventory. But when you take out isoprene, it's actually much closer, but without isoprene, it would slightly underestimate. So every footprint contains a multitude of sources and more than one land cover type. This is showing from one spot on our flight path what a typical footprint looked like that we're integrating over. And so trying to get an idea of what's in each measurement requires doing a footprint disaggregation. And this is the same approach that Ron described previously that they applied for NOx. We did it the same way for VOCs. And through that, we could try to differentiate the observations or disaggregate the observations into specific source categories. And so we've developed emission profiles for all these different source categories, from dairies, oil and gas, oak shrubland. Citrus packing and processing actually turned out to be an interesting one. Citrus crops themselves, and then there was an ethanol factory that we could look at as well. And so the ethanol factory mostly had ethanol emissions. The oak shrublands were dominated by the isoprene emissions with some monoterpenes. The oil and gas was dominated by hydrocarbons, and the dairies were dominated largely by oxygenated VOCs, ethanol, other alcohols, acids. The citrus packing and processing plants were rather interesting because they were point sources, and when we flew over them, we saw huge amounts of monoterpenes because in a lot of those plants, they're taking citrus products and squeezing them, or else even extracting material from the skins. And there were a lot of ethanol emissions and monoterpene emissions, and I think it's because ethanol is actually used in the extraction process to try to take the monoterpenes out of the skins, and those are useful chemicals for industrial processes. And again, now for the citrus crops, we saw a lot of monoterpene emissions, and citrus was one of the dominant crops for VOC emissions from agriculture in the Central Valley. So here we're just comparing the total flux that we observed in different types of systems. And one of the interesting things that came out of that is the only place that we saw substantial deposition was actually in the oak woodlands that were on the eastern edge of the valley, and we could see deposition of some alcohols and carbonyls, acids, other compounds, but generally we also saw the isoprene emissions. We could also go to individual types of plants, and here are the citrus processing. You can see what the signature looked like with a fair amount of monoterpenes. The ethanol factory had very high emissions, but of course it's just over a small area, but it was dominantly ethanol emissions. And the oil and gas field emissions were actually quite low compared to some of these other sources. Let's see. When we scale those emissions by their OH reactivity, we see some pretty significant differences between types of wind cover, and in particular, the citrus crops and the oaks really stood out, as well as the developed regions, as having a large OH reactivity to the flux, and also the citrus processing and ethanol factories had large contributions just for those specific types of point sources. I want to say a few words, this is bringing me towards the end of what I'm presenting, on that show the temperature-dependent emissions for some compounds. Here we're showing the same region in 3 different temperatures, low, medium, and high. And you can see that the colors go from lower emissions to brighter colors, higher emissions at high temperature. There's a very strong temperature dependence to isoprene that's well known, but we measured that well in these campaigns, and the temperature dependence actually matched what's in the models for those specific areas quite well. We also saw that the dairy and cattle farm operations had some very strong temperature dependence. So some of the compounds that we saw that had clear temperature dependence, and here we're showing low, medium, and high temperatures versus the flux, included the methanol, the acetone, the formic acid, and the acetic acid. So there's a significant temperature dependence to those dairy emissions, and that is currently not well represented by emission inventories, and that's something that I think the regulatory community could really make improvements in. Okay, I'm going to switch over to Ron to talk about some of our summary of key findings.
Yeah, so I think, overall, you've heard a couple things. You've heard the importance of a perspective on emission inventories that's process-based, that's different for different kinds of industry and land use, and that accurately incorporates the way temperature interacts with the emissions. And so that conceptual framing is key to all of our conclusions. Overall, what we saw is that VOC and NOx inventories representing traffic emissions, which 15 years ago dominated the story and would have meant we were mostly correct 15 years ago for what the important OH and SOA terms. That term is more consistent with observations than the ones representing terms that we haven't followed in cities and in air quality models as well, because they weren't as important before. And that's biogenics, volatile chemical products, cooking. Those other sources are not modeled as well, and that shouldn't be surprising because they don't have the 5 decades of attention that traffic does. In the San Joaquin Valley, the observed fluxes underestimate soil NOx fluxes by about a factor of 10 in order of magnitude. They underestimate dairy and citrus processing VOC fluxes, and they overestimate biogenic isoprene fluxes. In the South Coast, observations reveal the inventory overestimates NOx emissions near the coast while underestimating inland. The underestimation, we think we understand that it's due to increased warehousing in the eastern portion of that basin, and you saw for the some of the VOC pointed to the same thing, that chemicals that we know to be associated with diesel traffic were higher in the eastern portion of the basin. Both the VOC and the NOx supporting that attribution. In the South Coast, the inventory underestimates biogenic VOCs for mono and sesquiterpenes by order of a factor of 5. And additionally, the results highlight just how important the biogenic terpenoid emissions contribute on average. There's of order 60% to the ozone forming compounds and the secondary aerosol formation in summertime LA. And it's a fraction that increases with temperature, and that temperature dependence is largely missing from the current inventories. And I'll just remind you that in one of the first pictures Alan showed, we showed you our aircraft flying over LA. We think of LA as the home to the car. LA is really green. People who live in LA live in houses and on streets that have lots and lots of trees. And those trees are an important part of the landscape. They're an important part of what regulates temperature in the basin. Trees, when they release water, when they're photosynthesizing, help cool the region. So they reduce the temperature effect of the trees, reduces the probability of a high ozone event by mitigating temperature. But the VOC part of the trees at high temperatures drives high ozone. And that's a trade-off we need to explore, and one where we need to really think about the trees where we get the most cooling for the least VOC. We're going to advise the part of the urban planning system that is thinking about planting 1 million new trees in Los Angeles, for example. Next slide, Aaron. So we have some recommendations for modeling. We think it's important that a modern soil NOx emission model replace what's in BICE or Megan. Neither of those is a modern soil NOx emission model, but those are what's there in the current air quality models, many of them. We want to emphasize it to get the temperature dependence of ozone and SOA right in either of the places that we're talking about. We need to get the temperature dependence of biogenic emissions and monoterpenes to be updated, and we need to get the land use correct, because even if we have the right mechanism and temperature dependence of biogenic emissions, if we have a pixel that doesn't have the right amount of trees, it doesn't matter. The temperature dependence of solvent emissions is poorly represented right now. You saw a number of examples in Alan's slides where there was one point where the observations and the emissions model overlapped, but the derivative with temperature was not right in almost any of those. And then there are lots and lots of specific processes, heterogeneous land use and heterogeneous human activity, each of which contributes different kinds of emissions. And we need to have the right overall amount of those sectors in our models. And if we're going to test them, we need those in the right locations. But it's especially important to note that 15, 20 years ago, this didn't matter so much because the emissions that drove urban chemistry were dominated by cars. And really why this much more complicated story is so important today is that we've done a fabulous job cleaning up the emissions from cars. And as a result, many, many more different kinds of things are important today than were important 15, 20 years ago. You saw some examples in Alan's slides of the relative importance of different sectors. And you saw the difference in the mass emissions, which might have been dominated by ethanol, but the OH reactivity, which might have been dominated by isoprene, and the aerosol production, which might have been dominated by monoterpenes. So that where we give the most attention going forward really has to be tailored to the problem we're trying to solve. To the extent that it's aerosol, then we really want to pay most attention to monoterpene emitters. If it's ozone, then it might be a mix of isoprene and monoterpenes. And then just want to say that, overall, the anthropogenic NOx emissions are in better shape than the anthropogenic VOC emissions. Not because we intrinsically did a better job, but because cars and trucks are still the most important thing. In the San Joaquin, where cars and trucks are not the most important, what you saw is we need to do quite a bit of work on the agricultural NOx. In the cities where it's still cars and trucks, what we're missing is the land use. In this case, the warehouses in San Bernardino are really what's driving not having the emission inventory right. We probably have the right emission factors or close to for cars and trucks, but we don't have the right activity. So the last slide, I think. So that I think we'll point out sort of two ways that we might, circle back as emission inventories are improved in light of these results. We're going to continue to see changing emissions in the future as we grapple with how to manage climate. We'll see a concerted effort to try and reduce methane emissions from cattle. We don't know what effects that might have on the VOC emissions from cattle ranching. We'll see changes in CO2 emissions in cars and all kinds of activities in our cities. And so we think it would be important to repeat this sort of experiment and be able to supplement the ground-based measurements with direct flux measurements, on some regular time scale. 5 years might be about right to capture the trends that we might expect from changing human behavior. And then we'll just add that so much of what's happening in the in atmospheric science is driven by our response to trying to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we do this again, we really should have a very concerted approach to bringing the greenhouse gases into the fluxes and vice versa. What we're doing at the surface to characterize NOx and VOC emissions should really have the greenhouse gases co-located so that we can have synergistic thinking about how we're responding to climate management and air quality management, because we know those go hand in hand. So I want to thank all of you for listening. We're happy to take your questions now. And I want to thank CARB for their support in this project. It was really, really fun to do this work. We had a fabulous team, and it's just a pleasure to be able to tell you about it.
Yeah, and I just want to add my thanks as well. I'm willing to admit that I had been dreaming about doing this project for about 10 years, ever since we did it first for mainly isoprene over the San Joaquin Valley, and to be enabled by CARB and the South Coast Air Quality Management District to actually go out and do this, to have the support from the NOAA team that was doing a lot of our meteorology work, to work closely with our colleagues at the Naval Postgraduate School, and also to have the team from Caltech join us. It was really amazing, very exciting scientifically, and I hope that our results results are actually of practical use to the California Resources Board and the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And I thank Shane for managing the project and all the others at CARB who were involved.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ron. It's a great talk, and also thank you for your great effort. I think this is a very novel and very product campaign, and we hope to continue to collaborate with you on similar campaigns. And now we have time for questions or comments. David, please. You can unmute yourself, I think. David? Hello, David. I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thank you for the great presentation today. I'm David Kuros, and my group at CARB oversees all the mobile source emissions inventories. So I was happy to see that for the most part, the mobile source inventory seemed to be doing half decent. I was wondering if you had any more detailed data near the port complex during the big shock to the freight system in 2021, and if you were able to see any of the excess emissions that we had estimated were happening due to the port congestion and then subsequent higher freight volumes. We had estimated something like 30 tons per day excess NOx emissions during that peak congestion period, which isn't trivial considering the total emissions in the air basin. Just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that in particular.
We tried pretty hard to measure things at the coast. I'd say it's operationally super difficult because of the frequent cloudiness. And I think that the emissions that you're talking about are point source emissions from the boats themselves. And so they're not as easy as a line source emission from a highway to capture. So, both things made it more difficult. That said, we didn't see the evidence that we were expecting for really high emissions near the coast, and we would like to be able to do that in a way with a smaller aircraft even than this one, where you could get underneath the marine layer. Might be one way, or ability to directly target an individual ship and count the ships. But yeah, we couldn't confirm that as hard as we tried.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that another issue again at the coast is the time of year that we were flying. There's often this marine layer that Ron was talking about, and so if that was really the target, going back at a different time of year might make sense, and one could consider when is the best time to get accurate flux measurements along the coast.
But I would guess, David, that in the same way you guys are doing a great job on cars, there's been a lot of measurements of individual ships, and so I would guess that your estimate of ships is probably on target.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then we'll just look into what we might be missing on the eastern part of the basin with the spatial allocation for the warehousing. So thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple papers in the works that looked at the tropomi data and the concentrations from space that are also supporting that conclusion. So I think it's robust from a number of perspectives.
Scott?
Hi guys, thanks for the presentation, super interesting. So we hypothesized that there was a lot more use of hand sanitizer during the time period of your measurements. And ethanol, right, that's the main ingredient in hand sanitizer, at least in a lot of them. We also saw really crazy ozone exceedances during 2020, and I realized that was before your measurement, right? Which also led us to think that maybe there were some additional VOCs that hadn't been around in the past. So do you maybe have any ideas or any sense of how much this ethanol underestimation in the inventory is maybe more of a fleeting thing, or would that persist?
So a couple thoughts. One, I'll admit that I haven't done the specific math on the hand sanitizers, but if you look at the volume of ethanol used in hand sanitizers versus the volume of ethanol in beer consumed, it's not even going to be close. A lot more alcohol consumption. There's also a lot of ethanol in fuel, and so there's some emissions from that. We've done a lot of work in my group in indoor air in residences, and one of the shocking things that we find there is that the ethanol concentrations indoors, particularly in residences, is extremely high, and it can be high due to a variety of kinds of emissions, but many of the extreme emissions are actually due to things like alcohol use, and also to cleaning products and to cooking. An amazing array of things that we cook contain ethanol. And so as soon as you heat them up on the stove, the ethanol is evaporated. Literally putting bread into the toaster causes a spike in ethanol because that's a fermented product and it's full of ethanol. And when you heat it up, that ethanol comes out. I never once in our indoor air data saw evidence of hand sanitizers. Not once. So it's probably there, but it's a really, really minor contribution. And I don't think that it plays a significant role at the larger scale for the LA area or the San Joaquin Valley. In the San Joaquin Valley, a lot of the ethanol emissions that are not represented in the inventory, I suspect, are related to the dairies. At least that's one major source.
So I want to just add by reminding you of Alan's pie chart that showed how important ethanol was to the flux, the mass flux, and then how different that pie chart looked if you had the OH reactivity, which is what drives your ozone. And I would say if you go back to your 2020, I would really ask you to compare days with similar temperature and not just the number of violations in April. It was the weather. There were so many COVID-related papers that didn't take weather into account, and they mistook a warm spring for COVID effects. And so I think I've gone and looked at it, but it's been a long time. My memory is that if you just plotted the likelihood of violating the standard at temperature, there was nothing unusual about 2020.
Yeah, it's funny. We first all the articles, we had this really clean period because it was cool and wet. And all the articles were like, oh, it's really clean. And then we had that heat wave. Then all the articles like, oh, there's all this extra ozone due to COVID. So yeah, we agree.
Ravi, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Ravi Ramalingam. I'm with the Consumer Products Program at CARB, and just wanted to respond further to Scott's observations about hand sanitizer. That's something that we were concerned about also, and so we looked into it. We've purchased data from Nielsen, which gave us information on sales of hand sanitizer, and what we've seen is that there certainly was a big spike in usage, as you'd imagine, in 2020, even 2021. Usage has come down considerably. We're going to continue to track it. It's still being used more than it was before the pandemic, but at much lower levels than at the height of things. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? It's 2 minutes over 4. If there's no questions, I'd like to thank Ron and Alan again for your excellent talk and your efforts in this campaign. And also thank you everybody for your attention, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you again.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.